Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. The marks of the British and other empires are visible almost everywhere in today's world. Later on, we're going to be talking about whether Africa is at last emerging from the long colonial age, led by a cheetah generation of entrepreneurs, bloggers and inventors. So says Mariam Jamme of Senegal. And then there's the great rising power of the age, China, where the humiliations of Western imperialists are still vividly recalled. But how to get perspective? Sun Shuyun is a filmmaker starting out on the awesome task of making a full television series explaining Chinese history to the rest of the world. First, however, the legacy and meaning of the British Empire. Richard Gott is a man of the left, former Guardian journalist and now a historian, whose book Britain's Empire is its history seen from the viewpoint of those invaded by us and who fought back. But we're going to start inside the blood-soaked, red-coated square where Jeremy Paxman holds aloft the tattered Union flag and asks a different question. What did ruling the world do to the British? Jeremy, it's made us a much more multicultural, mingled country, certainly, and it's probably kept us more militaristic as a society than we'd otherwise be. What do you single out as the kind of key things that the Empire has done for today's British?
I think it's had an absolutely profound influence. I think, as you mentioned already, anything that changes the very genetic makeup of a people clearly has a significant impact. I would argue that it's instrumental in the fact that we still have a monarchy. I think it's instrumental in the fact that we still belong to a union. The Scots joined forces with England when their own empire collapsed and bankrupted the country. I would think it has serious influence upon the decisions of people like Cameron in Libya, Blair in 6 wars, Margaret Thatcher in several wars, to send a readiness to send troops onto foreign missions of one kind or another. I mean, we just come through the 10th anniversary of Afghanistan. That's the first American war in Afghanistan. It is the third British war in Afghanistan, neither of the previous ones being conspicuous successes. So I think it's had a whole range of influences, not the least of them leaving us with a sense that we are somehow special. And that, I think, partly explains why we have such difficulty with the rest of Europe. And
does it also mean that we are endlessly confused about who we are and our own past, veering between sort of pride in empire that this small collection of islands had such a large splodge of red across the world versus hideous embarrassment about some of the things we did, and never been quite able to settle between those two poles?
Well, I think we are very, very confused about what our identity is and whether we should be proud or embarrassed, and there are things we should be proud of, I would argue. Richard here will disagree, I'm sure. But there are many things of which we should be ashamed, rightly ashamed. But they happened. Our country was responsible for them. They happened. We can't deny them. So it does, I think, contribute to a sense of confused identity. The main reason I wanted to write the book was that it seems to me that what is taught now is a narrative that the whole thing is purely a cause for shame. I mean, no one is taught the empire in school as a discrete subject. They are taught modules about slavery, for example, and slavery is something of which we should be profoundly ashamed, but they're not taught very much about the British suppression of slavery after they abolished it, and then when they deployed the Royal Navy to free slaves. It was an abolition of slavery, a campaign against slavery was the motivation for David Livingstone setting off across Africa, for example. He was a completely useless missionary. I mean, he made one convert in almost the whole of his career.
Yeah.
But he was passionate about slavery, and we tend not to be taught that.
And when you look at why the empire happened, an amazing mingling of motives. You've got the first empire, you've got the American empire is about Puritans trying to escape repression in Britain, as well as commercial tobacco growers and so on, the sugar trade. The Indian Empire, we just happened to arrive at the time another empire, the Mughal Empire, is collapsing, which is very convenient.
No, I think the impulse in the Indian Empire is the same as in the original states of America. It's Jack the Lad characters, really, on the make, people after a quick fortune. And someone like Robert Clive, who essentially established the British in India, Robert Clive, if he were living today, would be at least the subject of an ASBO and probably in a young offenders institution.
Unless he'd made it to a hedge fund by then. I mean, you know...
He went when he was 17, you know. I mean, he was a local tearaway, an absolute menace in the town in Shropshire in which he grew up. So these acquisitions, if you just look at the map, the thing is spread over such an odd collection of territories. It clearly was not planned, but it was acquired as a consequence of individual acts. Very many of them acts of greed and rapacity, and on other occasions acts of administrative convenience, military conquest, and the rest. But it tends to be collected in a haphazard kind of way, I think.
There's one thing that we haven't talked about in terms of today's Britain. You talked about the monarchy and the military and so on. But this was a saltwater empire. We were a very naval people, and that is something that has gone pretty much.
Well, if you look at the state of the Navy now, if you imagine the humiliation that occurred when those sailors were captured in the Persian Gulf. I mean, that would not have happened to the old Navy. And we were, of course, we were a saltwater nation. Most countries, European countries, which had a seashore, did acquire overseas possessions. That is certainly true. There is something, I think, that happens to a people if you live on an island. Everywhere requires a journey by sea, obviously, and that, I think, conditions the way that you look at the rest of the world. And even now, I think we look at the world very differently to the way many other countries look at it. And you can measure that in the possession of passports, for example, involvement of forces sent by governments of one political hue or another to fight overseas. The
organisation like the BBC, one could
the
say.
BBC, charities. There is still a profound connection, I think.
In Jeremy's book, Richard Gott, there's quite a focus on the high-minded Victorians going out there feeling that there's a sense of higher purpose, higher duty, partly religious, partly civilising mission. In your view, is that all nonsense, or was there an element of high-mindedness that you would acknowledge there too?
Oh yes, in a curious way, I think there are two narratives of the British Empire. One by the conquering lot, and one by the conquered. And in my book, I'm trying to write about the views of the conquered. And it's especially important, it seems to me, as Jeremy says, that the heirs to the conquered have come back to live in Britain. And therefore, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to discuss history of empire in this country is that we have these two groups, the heirs of the conquerors and the heirs of the conquered.
We're only over here because you were over there. As is in the common phrase.
That's the argument. But, so I think that any future... And, Jeremy is absolutely right that the history of the empire is not much taught in schools or indeed in universities. There's quite a lot of high-minded work done on the empire, but it doesn't seem to me to percolate through. And that's the reason for that, I think, is because there is no agreed narrative between these.
Because it's difficult for a teacher to stand up in front of a class.
This is really healthy.
It's wonderful, but you were saying, it's far too many people are complaining about the nature of empire, and I'm complaining that far too many people think it was a wonderful thing.
Well, you start your book. Sorry, but your first sentence is about a book published in 1908, Our Empire Story, which asserts that the British Empire was an undilutedly good thing, which I accept was the prevailing view. But over 100 years have gone by since then, Richard. It seems to me that in your attack, you are attacking something that is no longer the prevailing wisdom. You're attacking a prevailing wisdom of Edwardian times. And fair enough, good luck to you. But it's completely irrelevant now.
Well, I disagree. I think the view of Our Empire Story is absolutely prevalent, not only in Britain.
How many people do you know have read it?
Well, it's curious now, how many people have you... I think people have read it in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand.
Our Empire Story.
Absolutely. It's still... That is the view that still percolates through.
Because,
you are claiming that the empire is still taught as a cause of pride nowadays.
Absolutely.
Certainly, if you look at... I would have thought there has been a vast gap between the old pride-driven, good old us story and where we are today, filled by almost nothing. In the sense that there haven't been narratives, and I suspect Richard might be right in saying that you can't stand up as a teacher in a London school easily and look at the kind of range of faces staring back at you and give one kind of story about the empire, which is perhaps why people fumble on...
Exactly. That's why it's a very, very interesting thing to explore. But you are saying the opposite of what Richard has just said, which is that He says there's one prevailing narrative. You have just conceded there isn't one prevailing narrative because the circumstances at home have changed so much. I would argue there are other things too, but the circumstances have changed at home have changed so much that this Edwardian view of that the empire was a good thing is just completely out of date nowadays.
So what we have here, we're going to come back to in a second, we have a wonderfully introspective British argument about who we are, being observed by Shuyun and Mariam Jamme from different perspectives. What do you two make of this? Mariam, first of all.
Well, I think the colonialism is a bad thing, definitely. It was a very, very bad thing. Today, if you go to Africa, you can see the 5 regions in Africa, how this has affected us. My view about the colonies is that, our leadership is affected in Africa, for example. We don't have any confidence anymore. Like Sekou Touré said, we have complex in Africa. For me, maybe you guys, the British Empire today saying, okay, we went there, we give them, a certain life. But you can go there and see what's happening in the continent.
Absolutely. Are you saying there weren't any conflicts in Africa before the colonists arrived?
There was a conflict.
I agree, colonialism did some terrible things.
I understand, but Jeremy, what I'm saying is that today you can see the legacy of colonialism in Africa. That's why we're not progressing today. Even not the mentalities, the mindset. Everything has an impact into our lives today. So that's why I think I read your book. It's a wonderful book to make sure that people understand today. What the empire has done to our continent. You see the leadership today in Rwanda, in many, many countries. We are stuck. We can't progress. The mentality cannot progress because of that. African people don't trust each other. That's one thing. Because
and they did before?
There were no
tribal conflicts in Africa before
but they did
arrival of the
before we had the
colonists?
Palaver tree. We had a Palaver tree where this was our wisdom. Where
what the Palaver tree was.
Well,
sorry, that's your job, Andrew.
The Palaver tree is, we used to sit down under the Palaver tree to discuss our issues. We used to have this. Now we don't have it anymore.
But yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think it's very healthy for me to listen to Jeremy and Richard's debate and Marianne, because I think it's healthy to have this debate. In China, I think the sense of, Jeremy mentioned Opium War in his book, and it was a profoundly humiliating episode in our history. There's no doubt about it. And that defined the end of the Chinese Empire for 2,000 years.
The Opium War, we better explain, I suppose.
Yes.
No, we don't need to explain the Opium War. Not to Radio 4 listeners.
Radio
You're
4
all right,
listeners
Jeremy.
are very well educated, but they ought to be reminded, perhaps, shouldn't they, that it was
the Opium War? I think everyone knows about the Opium War.
The British forcible selling of opium into China in the 19th century, forcing the Chinese to accept it. I mean,
They were smoking opium before the British arrived, Jeremy.
I know, of course they were. So were senior emperors. But the war was a consequence of British commercial policy.
I think Jeremy was right there. And today, when you think of the narcotic war in this country, and it's probably hard for the young people or for people of this country to imagine that 160 years ago, in 1838, on the eve of the First Opium War, when Britain dumped 1,500 tons of opium to China to make up for the trade deficit which they imported from China for tea, for coffee, for tea, for silk, and for porcelain. But that, in a way, is defining our attitudes. And the brutality of that war and impact it's still in our National Museum. Recently, our National Museum History opened on Tiananmen Square, the heart of China. And in the biggest museum in the world, officially now, by probably a few hundred meters, the Louvre and the British Museum. And in it is this humiliation of the Opium War and the road to recovery, to national regeneration.
There's lots of things that aren't in it, I have to say. There's very little about the Cultural Revolution and so on. There's huge gaps in this museum as well.
There's a famous photograph in it.
Exactly.
Of the young man defying the tank. Is that in the Tiananmen Square Museum?
There's some very, very nice paintings of Chairman Mao, though. Anyway, let's return, if we can, to the conversation that we'd started about the two different versions of the British Empire, and then we'll come back to... Richard, you've told a lot of the stories of the people who revolted and resisted, whether in Australia or in South America, lots of places around the world, the British Empire. One of the underlying truths about this, though, is that, as Jeremy was suggesting, there were lots of empires before. In a sense, there were empires in Africa. There were certainly empires across Asia. The Chinese had a kind of empire before. Mughals had an empire. So it's not just when we talk about empire versus non-empire. In this country, we tend to think empire means British Empire, but we were just late comers, weren't we?
Yes, and there were almost every country in Europe had an empire.
Including the Swedes.
But that doesn't mean that it justifies empire in any way. And I mean, my argument is that the subject peoples, as I call them, didn't want the British there. They did their best to throw them out. They said, we're going to throw you into the sea. And the British used incredible force over a couple of centuries. Much of the empire, much of the time, was conducted under martial law. The governors were military governors, and that was
there was huge exploitation as well.
Yeah, but whenever one society has had a technological advantage over the next, they seem to have invaded and gone to war and used it aggressively. It seems to be almost bred in the bone, doesn't it?
It was not entirely true, because when we look at this age, Jeremy in his book talk about this explorers of the British Empire very much represent the Enlightenment, the 18th century Enlightenment ideas of seeking knowledge. But when you look at China, for example, we look at the Great Voyage of the Ming Dynasty of the 15th century, these unique admirals commanding a fleet of 300 ships,
vast ships,
27,000 people, and going all the way from China through Persian Gulf, Arab countries, and east coast to Africa, along the Cape of Good Hope, and some claimed they went even to America. I doubt it very much. But that had a gunboat, had the gunpowder, which the Chinese invented, had a compass, which Chinese invented, and after 30 years, from 1405 to 1433, which almost bankrupted the country, what did you get? They go to a country, they said, would you like to come and pay tributes to our emperor? No? Okay, then we leave you alone. Only a few times of these 30 years.
But he was after treasure in the end as well, wasn't he?
They brought a giraffe, which was so exotic.
Expensive giraffe.
Very expensive giraffe. And put it in the Forbidden City, and it died of the freezing cold, of course. But what else they brought?
Was this at the
Very
time?
little flag planting.
Was this at the time the Chinese thought they were the centre of the world? Maybe that's what it was about. Because
they've always thought that, Jared.
Well, it's interesting.
Still do.
It's a big deal, because when you're a huge country like that, Britain was never anything other than a cold, wet island in the North Atlantic, and knew that.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the difference between these two things. The Chinese go to bring things back to pay tribute to the greatest, most magnificent civilization on Earth, the centre of the Earth, and the British, realising they are otherwise an irrelevance, actually go out and take places. I don't know, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but it's a possibility.
I think that doesn't explain what Richard was saying, the violence, use of violence. If the Chinese have that superiority, they could say, you should all go. But many refused. Many did come because the emperors gave them such a generous gift, so they would go back probably better off than they came. But that did not explain why they didn't use their overwhelming force.
Also, there's a huge question, of course, what would have happened had the Chinese kept their fleets rather than destroying them? I mean, that's the real question. It was the beginning of something. Richard, do you think that the British Empire behaved better or worse than other comparative empires? Better, no doubt, than the Belgian Empire in the Congo, which was the worst of the worst. But overall?
I think they were all equally bad. I think the British have always tried to say, oh, wait, we were much better than the French or much better than the Spanish. I think that's absolute nonsense. For example, in South Africa, it's always said that the Dutch settlers were much worse than the British settlers. All the evidence is that we did exactly the same, and we exterminated people, and we behaved in an appalling way. And I think that the idea that Britain was somehow better is a national myth that we have encouraged, and it's wrong.
Is that a national myth that you encourage in your book,
Jeremy? Equally is a very odd word for you to choose, Richard. I mean, equally by comparison with the Belgian slave colony in the Congo? Equally?
Equally, yes, absolutely.
Yes. I think
absolutely.
if you think about it, for example,
people didn't get their hands chopped off for failing to deliver the requisite quantity of rubber.
That's
really
one aspect of that story, but the British did comparable things, if you like, not equal things.
And I absolutely agree with you also about the fearsome enforcement of British rule. There was a military doctrine around the time of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, which is expressed in military handbooks, saying, if there is a rebellion, it must be put down mercilessly and with severe retribution.
Which ends up with Amritsar and the loss of British India so swiftly after that.
Amritsar's
which is
1919, and it's a bit. There are long arguments about that. Actually,
General Dyer's behaviour.
There's a new book out on it, isn't there? You should get him on next week.
General Dyer's behaviour was exactly that. There's a crowd, and he orders the troops to shoot directly into the crowd. I suspect we're not going to come to a little consensual bubble of agreement on this side of the table, so we're going to move swiftly on. I'm all for consensus and agreement. Yes, I am. Fight you for it. Okay, let's move on a little bit to Africa today. Mariam Jamme, you've been talking about the bloggers and the cheetah generation and the people that are coming forward. Earlier on you said that Africa lacked self-confidence. Its leadership groups lacked self-confidence. Africans didn't trust one another as a result of empire. But you also you think that this is not a universal story across Africa, that there are parts of Africa that are starting to slough off the imperial and colonial thing. In this country, certainly, most of the coverage of Africa is the coverage of failure, corruption, famine, civil war, exploitation today. What is it that we are missing in our coverage then?
Well, I'm sitting with Andrew Marr and Jeremy Paxman, so I'm a bit scared to say many things.
Yeah.
But I think part is to blame the BBC. We can blame the BBC for the negative narratives that the NGOs tell them on advertisement, for example. Save the Children will say to the BBC, put some images for dying children there, and we can get some money out of it. And I've been trying to fight for this these images we show to the British public, and in the end.
So what are the positive stories? What are the stories that
there are amazing
we're missing?
Stories in Africa, for example. I think the British public deserve to know that maybe we have an empire going to Africa, wherever it is, but I think they deserve to know that there's progress in the continent. The cheetah generation, the people who studied in the West for many, many years, they're going back to their home countries to make a difference. The leadership is getting better, and Rwanda is getting better. We know, there's a controversy regarding Paul Kagame, but he's doing amazingly well. You go to Mozambique, they're doing amazingly well. You have hubs now in Africa where the social entrepreneurs are doing, amazingly well. The new technology is growing. People are creating businesses within the continent. You have economists in Africa. You've got amazing guys within the continent, and good stories. I go across Africa, I see good stories there, but I never heard them when I come back. When I take the plane back to Heathrow, and I switch off the TV, what do I see? The negative stories about Africa.
And this is because of the aid industry. You would argue,
the aid industry is the NGOs, the micro intervention they're doing, which is useless in my view. For me, the NGOs are. I do fight with them all the time, because they don't give the good stories about what's happening in Africa. 60 years.
Which are the countries in your view then that are doing best in Africa?
Kenya is doing amazingly well right now. Kenya is doing fantastically well. Tanzania, they're doing great. Ethiopia, they're doing amazingly well. There are many, many countries. We need to divide. I think the British public need to know. We need to divide African regions so people they understand where the empire had the empire had an influence. I think we need to divide them. Like the West Africa, for example, the French have done badly in West Africa. So West Africa right now, if you go there, the mentality, people are lazy.
Senegal,
Mali, Burkina Faso, they're lazy. They jet set. They're coming to Europe. Their wives are in big hotels in England. So and if you go down the street to Kaolack, where I go and see my girls, they're very poor down there. So then you see.
But to what extent is the problem in Africa, the general problem, has been the drawing of lines to create countries which didn't organically exist before, and in which different tribal groups have to coexist, often mutually mistrusting each other, and therefore the difficulty of building a leadership elite and a democratic system in whatever box has been drawn on the map.
Yeah, but I think what the empire did is to divide us as the tribe. For example, in Senegal, the Wolof are divided by the Serer, ethnic groups, their class people. So now what you see, there is a cycle where the Wolof now are trying to take the power, where the President Wade is now, he used to be the lower class. Now he's top, and he doesn't want to give up the power. And what you see also is that, right now in West Africa, there's a big problem, big issue compared to East Africa, where there's massive progress.
Well, I want to, before I draw up the pavilion, I want to ask about one other big area, which is Chinese involvement in Africa, because the huge new investment in buying up land, moving into East Africa in particular.
The new empire.
The new empire, it could be said.
I don't think it's a new empire, Jeremy. It's not a new empire. I think the problem we have, there is a fear. There's a fear. It's not a new colonialism. Africa right now is the hottest date in town. Right? Everybody wants to date Africa, but nobody knows what's happening with Africa.
Because you've got raw materials and you've got land.
Yeah, but people don't know. So what Chinese people are doing is they go in there with a new strategy, different way of dating, and and now they will have the girl in the end. That's the thing.
They're
now
nicer.
The British people are choosing a way of dating Africa, and they dated Africa many times in France and whatever, and they couldn't date the girl. Now Chinese is hot, is dating it, and now they all get upset. That's the problem.
Marianne, I must say that's a very...
Shuyun, you're dating Mariam on air, live.
I think that is really such a vivid metaphor, but I think there are three things. First of all, talking about this bad press, I think the Chinese probably has got equally bad press, a bad coverage in the Western press. And there was a study of New York Times coverage of China in the last 20 years by American Duke University. In the last 20 years, three things consistently on the top of the agenda: human rights, Tibet, and this city urbanization.
What made it matter?
People moved to the cities. And despite extraordinary changes that happened in China, the three items didn't really change at all in terms of the coverage. But I think, when we look at Jeremy's book, I think what is so interesting when I look at it is how Britain, that's the part of the imperial legacy, how Britain saw its role. And you said how, Chinese would be puzzled. Britain, being such a small island, sits on the United Nations, Security Council.
Still baffled, aren't they?
And still baffled. And what gave them the right, the sense of superiority racially. In those days, you quoted Mr. Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes, one of the most successful empire builder.
To be born English is won first prize in the lottery
exactly.
of life. Yes.
I think that's how they treated people. I think in a way that mentality is still deeply ingratiated in this report.
You could argue it's not attractive. You could argue that one of the benign legacies of empire is to make that kind of proposition that we are sort of somehow racially superior to other people almost impossible to voice in modern Britain, because it has now become such a mixed country. Whereas I know a lot of Chinese who would say we are the dominant.
But that's really even worse, because as Jeremy said, they are so keen to get going on this international stage and find a new role for itself, and that new role is still has this kind of sense of superiority behind the whole thinking, and for other people that's hard to accept.
Yes, I mean, I think the behaviour of the Western press towards the outside world is absolutely incredible, and I completely agree. The coverage of China is appalling. The coverage of Africa is appalling. I'd really like Mariam's remarks about NGOs and the way that they are allowed to dominate the news agenda, because there are not very many Western reporters in Africa. They have to go around and talk to the NGOs who are there in force, and they give them this incredibly biased view of what's going on. And let me give you an example. For example, we all know that there's a terrible famine and terrible trouble in Somalia. Yeah. 9 out of 10 articles never refer to the fact that the British and the Americans persuaded the Ethiopians to invade Somalia in order to overthrow an Islamic government that the West didn't like, and that has, resulted in total chaos. But that is virtually never mentioned in the Western press.
And yet, I mean, another story. I guess we've been very heavily influenced by Zimbabwe in this country, because we were very involved in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's been a catastrophe. There's nothing to be said.
Andrew, it's a bad press. This is what I'm saying. Africa's PR.
Zimbabwe was one of the richest countries in Africa at the time of independence. It's now one of the poorest in the world.
Yeah, but I agree with you totally. But what are we saying? There's a bad PR for Africa. It has always been. We have a bad PR.
Bad reality.
Bad PR. Just wait. Bad PR. 60 years. Trillions of dollars gone to Africa. Nobody, I think we need to take our responsibility. The British Empire need to take the responsibility of what's happened in Africa and Zimbabwe today. If Zimbabwe is poor, yes, if Mugabe is giving, a head-headed about the situation, we need to take our responsibility.
But what's happening in Zimbabwe is his
responsibility
reform.
is apart from Mugabe.
Here, I agree with Jeremy. I think it is important. For example, China was in a bad state 30 years ago, really bad. I mean, my parents were starving. And yet, in the 30 years, reform propelled China to a nation.
Mugabe is an angry man. He's a very angry man. I understand that.
When you think, like during the Cultural Revolution, when the whole nation, the Chinese nation, were going through incredible suffering, and they were angry too. Yeah. But anger itself was not enough. I think we have to come with a structural reform to improve the society.
Let's move on at this point directly to China, because we haven't really talked properly about China. Shuyun, you're making a television series about Chinese history, and for an awful lot of people, I guess, outside China, the problems are the names, the complexities of the dynasties, trying to work out who came, what they all mean. So, first question: how do you start to give a shape to Chinese history for outsiders? Because there is this very, very long, apparently uninterrupted, it was interrupted, but apparently interrupted dynastic history of the emperors.
Yes, I'm going to start working on this series very soon with Michael Wood, and it will be a 2-year project. I think what is really important is it's true when you look at another country as complicated as China, you say, where do we start? I think the series really tries to help the viewers here and across the world and in China. This is co-production with Chinese television. What defines the Chinese as we know, the nation? And I think that's very important. For example, this strong authoritarian character, this is not a modern, affair. It went way back to 2,000 years ago. And then, of course, it has been helped by the Confucian thinking. And in the last 2,000 years, with a bureaucracy chosen entirely based on the Confucian classics. And you know what they do? They have to memorize 400,000 words from Confucian text, and they have to sit the exam, only recite one interpretation for the past 500 years.
So you could never have the evolution of an early literate middle class, because it was simply too difficult. There was, you didn't have an alphabet which allowed the middle classes in the West.
No, I think it's more than that. It's too much controlled, because if you have 500 years with one man's thought controlling the whole nation, the past 50 years of communist rule, 6 years of communist rule is nothing. It's a very, very
and
fleeting
Confucius
moment.
is coming back in a big way, of course, already, isn't he?
Very, very much so. But I think looking at history, I think each nation cherry picks its own history.
Okay, so this is a co-production with Chinese television. Does that not give you ideological problems? Because there is a sort of official narrative of Chinese history. Are you going to be able to challenge that or test that?
I hope we will be able to present history as argued by scholars from all over the world, not just by Chinese scholars, and not the least by the Chinese government. And that's why I said at the beginning I found Jeremy and Richard's argument was exciting. That's exactly what is lacking in China today. The party, I think, justifies its policies, especially the post-Opium War period. But I think we need to go beyond that. It is no point, very little point, just to have this victim mentality, to cry the wrongs of the doings, but also to look at the period. For example, we talk about the extraordinary age of exploration of the 15th century, when China did lead the world, and yet it didn't build an empire.
And so the question is, why did it not move on to the Industrial Revolution at the time? It had so many of the elements of industrial takeoff, didn't it?
Exactly.
And then it didn't quite happen.
But that was, again, refer back to what Jeremy said, the crucial age of the 18th century, the age of Enlightenment, when Europe, at the time, from Voltaire, from Diderot, from all these figures of the Enlightenment, looked at China as the nation, the most civilized nation, the best nation in the world, because it did not have religion, it did not have this fanaticism. It was ruled by emperor who seemed to be very rational. And then they used this weapon to beat the church. And then finally, Europe took off based on rationality, science and technology. And China stuck to its
Never
own
had its
way.
Enlightenment period.
No.
Are you going to have a big problem with the 20th century and the Kuomintang and the nationalists fighting the Japanese? Because, there is a narrative in China that the Japanese were beaten by Mao and the communists, and actually they weren't. They fought desperately against the nationalists, who in turn had to retreat to Taiwan.
When we look at the last 150 years from the Opium War, it's really the history of China in search of modernization. I think that is, whatever we say about this anti-imperialist past, there is a common path for humanity, and that is modernization. And that modernization comes with a lot of science, technology, freedom to think, freedom to argue, and representative government and civil societies. I think those are the values we have to look.
Do you think that this model they've got, where there is rule by the party driven by private enterprise, which is a contradiction really to those of us in the West, anyway, we don't understand it. Do you think it can last?
I think ultimately no. Because
so what will happen?
I think ultimately when people have enough to eat, they really demand more. That is the pattern of history. I don't think the unique model of Chinese development would justify
so
that.
The party will lose power.
I think the party would not necessarily lose its power. What it will do is try to regain.
Can you imagine it as a democracy?
I don't think democracy, as we understand in the West today, would be naturally.
Why is it less applicable to China than anywhere else?
I think each country probably would find its own path, whether it's a special election or whether it will be like a Singapore, evolving from that. After all, Taiwan, from military dictatorship in the last 20 years ago, now moved to a democracy. It worked. Yeah. So maybe that is the pattern.
We had a Chinese historian on this programme way back who said, what you in the West don't understand is you have an entire street of restaurants, but most of your restaurants, the parties, are basically selling the same kind of food. We only have one restaurant, but we have a longer menu. In other words, you can do different things in Shanghai and so on. That was the explanation. I give it to you with no further. Richard Gott.
I just want to sort of go back to the empire using your Chinese example, because in a curious way, the empire, British Empire, was rather like China in the sense that it had no free press, it had no freedom of speech, it had...
What?
No, I mean...
What are you talking about?
The empire, out in the empire, people, it was not a democracy. It was exactly like China. It was a sort of totalitarian regime with a British governor. And you're laughing because you can't think. You haven't read the details of what went on in the empire.
I have.
So was the freedom of speech really in British India?
No, there was
not for Indians. It wasn't.
No, there was, and it was by no stretch of the imagination can you call it democracy. I thought you were talking about home, but where there certainly was widespread dissent, as you know, and there were many journalistic outlets in the empire where dissenting views were expressed. But I agree with you, of course, by definition, an empire is not a democracy.
Right, but I mean, it's much worse than that. We threw journalists out of many countries when they were reporting things that the imperial masters didn't want to hear.
But I think we should give the British the credit, because like in Hong Kong, which was the product of the Opium War when it was ceded to Britain, there was the rule of law. And Hong Kong society is really, really good. And the other thing is, yes, it didn't have democracy, and it's only with a pattern when he was about to leave to say, let's have a free election.
Mariam, Jamme.
Yeah, I think what you were saying earlier about China want to, engage into modernization that's precisely what they're doing with Africa, in my view. I don't agree with everything they're doing, but the African leadership now need to take charge of what they're doing. They have their own destiny. They can say to Chinese government, we don't want to sign this sort of contract. So I think we need to relax. I think the West need to relax about the Chinese relationship with Africa, because now we mature. The African leadership is now mature, not mature as you will say in the United Kingdom. But we know what we want.
But I think China should be mindful, exactly reading
but they are mindful. I think they will be mindful. They will be mindful if we African people. I think we're talking about 19 many years ago. In those times, we were not mature.
Can I just ask both of you?
Yeah.
There is a sort of fundamental Western narrative that we end up with what might be called liberal democracy, where you have competing parties in some kind of parliamentary or assembly system, leaders can be removed by the vote and are regularly, and that is, as it were, the end point of political development. Now, would you both agree with that as a sort of trajectory, or do you think that itself is a kind of Western bias?
It's a Western bias because, we have our culture in Africa and we have our things in Africa. So one thing I know right now is that African leadership is mature. We know what we want to do with China. China is building roads in Africa where, the British Empire did it.
Parliament buildings in Africa. Does that strike you as appropriate?
It's not a parliament building, but the road. If you from Dakar to Kaolack, if you see that 3 hours, if Chinese people can build that in about a year, you will take it.
Shuyun.
I think ultimately, when the most active place in China right now is the Central Party School, which trains all the communist leaders, and what it does is provide a blueprint, hopefully from the village level into the towns, into the city, then go up. But the question is how long they would give the process, because I think the society is so troubled with all sorts of problems that have been accumulating since economic reform, whether ultimately they say, in 50 years' time we give it. Do we have 50 years? Perhaps not. Definitely not.
So there's a sense of holding the lid on during a period of extreme speedy growth. Yeah.
Yes, a transition. Yeah. But how long that will be, I think, is a big question.
We could talk about this for much longer, but we've unfortunately run out of time. Thanks to all my guests. Sun Shuyun's about to embark on that television series, The Story of China. Jamme is taking part in the discussion, Is This Africa's Decade? On Saturday at the Royal College of Art in London. Jeremy Paxman's Empire, What Ruling the World Did to the British, and Richard Gott's Britain's Empire, Resistance, Repression and Revolt are both out now. Next week, The Magic of Science, if there can be such a thing, and The Meaning of Faith, with Richard Dawkins, the Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and Lisa Randall. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for listening to this Radio 4 podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you might like to try others like it, such as In Our Time or Thinking Aloud, both of which are also available from the Radio 4 website.
And then when they deployed the Royal Navy to free slaves, it was abolition of slavery, a campaign against slavery was the motivation for David Livingstone setting off across Africa, for example. He was a completely useless missionary. I mean, he made one convert in almost the whole of his career.
Yeah.
But he was passionate about slavery, and we tend not to be taught that.
And when you look at why the empire happened, an amazing mingling of motives. You've got the first empire, you've got the American empire is about Puritans trying to escape repression in Britain, as well as commercial tobacco growers and so on, the sugar trade. The Indian Empire, we just happened to arrive at the time another empire, the Mughal Empire, is collapsing, which is very convenient.
No, I think the impulse in the Indian Empire is the same as in the original states of America. It's Jack the Lad characters, really, on the make, people after a quick fortune. And someone like Robert Clive, who essentially established the British in India, Robert Clive, if he were living today, would be at least the subject of an ASBO and probably in a young offenders institution.
Unless he'd made it to a hedge fund by then. I mean,
he went when he was 17. I mean, he was a local tearaway, an absolute menace in the town in Shropshire in which he grew up. So,
thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. The marks of the British and other empires are visible almost everywhere in today's world. Later on, we're going to be talking about whether Africa is at last emerging from the long colonial age, led by a cheetah generation of entrepreneurs, bloggers and inventors. So says Jamme of Senegal. And then there's the great rising power of the age, China, where the humiliations of Western imperialists are still vividly recalled. But how to get perspective? Sun Shuyun is a filmmaker starting out on the awesome task of making a full television series explaining Chinese history to the rest of the world. First, however, the legacy and meaning of the British Empire. Richard Gott is a man of the left, former Guardian journalist and now a historian, whose book Britain's Empire is its history seen from the viewpoint of those invaded by us and who fought back. But we're going to start inside the blood-soaked, red-coated square where Jeremy Paxman holds aloft the tattered Union flag and asks a different question. What did ruling the world do to the British? Jeremy, it's made up.
These acquisitions, if you just look at the map, the thing is spread over such an odd collection of territories. It clearly was not planned, but it was acquired as a consequence of individual acts. very many of them acts of greed and rapacity, and on other occasions acts of administrative convenience, military conquest and the rest. But it tends to be collected in a haphazard kind of way, I think.
There's one thing that we haven't talked about in terms of today's Britain. You talked about the monarchy and the military and so on. But this was a saltwater empire. We were a very naval people, and that is something that has gone pretty much.
Well, if you look at the state of the Navy now, yes. Indeed, if you imagine the humiliation that occurred when those sailors were captured in the Persian Gulf. I mean, that would not have happened to the old Navy. And of course we were a saltwater nation. Most countries, European countries, which had a seashore, did acquire overseas possessions. That is certainly true. There is something, I think, that happens to a people if you live on an island. Everywhere requires a journey by sea, obviously, and that, I think, conditions the way that you look at such difficulty with the rest of Europe.
And does it also mean that we are endlessly confused about who we are and our own past, veering between sort of pride in empire that this small collection of islands had such a large splodge of red across the world versus hideous embarrassment about some of the things we did, and never been quite able to settle between those two poles?
Well, I think we are very, very confused about what our identity is and whether we should be proud or embarrassed, and there are things we should be proud of, I would argue. Richard here will disagree, I'm sure. But there are many things of which we should be ashamed, rightly ashamed. But they happened. Our country was responsible for them. They happened. We can't deny them. So it does, I think, contribute to a sense of confused identity. The main reason I wanted to write the book was that it seems to me that what is taught now is a narrative that the whole thing is purely a cause for shame. I mean, no one is taught the empire in school as a discrete subject. They are taught modules about slavery, for example, and slavery is something of which we should be profoundly ashamed. But they're not taught very much about the British suppression of slavery after they abolished it.
As a much more multicultural, mingled country, certainly, and it's probably kept us more militaristic as a society than we'd otherwise be. What do you single out as the kind of key things that the empire has done for today's British?
I think it's had an absolutely profound influence. I think, as you mentioned already, anything that changes the very genetic makeup of a people clearly has a significant impact. I would argue that it's instrumental in the fact that we still have a monarchy. I think it's instrumental in the fact that we still belong to a union. The Scots joined forces with England when their own empire collapsed and bankrupted the country. I would think it has serious influence upon the decisions of people like Cameron in Libya, Blair in 6 wars, Margaret Thatcher in several wars, to send a readiness to send troops onto foreign missions of one kind or another. I mean, we just come through the 10th anniversary of Afghanistan. That's the first American war in Afghanistan. It is the 3rd British war in Afghanistan, neither of the previous ones being conspicuous successes. So I think it's had a whole range of influences, not the least of them leaving us with a sense that we are somehow special, and that, I think, partly explains why we